She is remembered as the Black Queen, a dark figure surrounded by poison, blood, and the occult in popular history. But her real story is far more striking. It all began on April 13, 1519, in Florence. That day, the cry of a newborn girl echoed through the Medici palace. According to a contemporary, her young parents welcomed her as though a boy had been born. They were wealthy, newly married, and surely believed there would be sons later. 15 days later, Catherine's mother, Madeleine, died. 6 days after that, her father, Lorenzo II de Medici, was dead as well. Catherine was not yet a month old. She was left as her parents' only legitimate child, and the legitimate male line of that branch of the family ended with her father. Other Medici would continue to live, have children, and fight for power, but in the household into which Catherine had been born, there would be no second child. News of the double loss reached her great-great-uncle, Pope Leo X. According to tradition, he received it with tears in his eyes and called her a child of sorrow, a name that would fall over her like a sentence long before she had done anything to deserve it. Florence knew her by a simpler name, Duchessina, the Little Duchess. Catherine was first raised by her grandmother, then by an aunt. She grew up among the women of the Medici family, surrounded by servants and tutors, well-educated and lacking nothing except the most basic things, parents and a home of her own. She passed from one household to another, always too valuable to be left to herself. At 8 years old, Catherine learned what her family name could cost her. In 1527, the enemies of the Medici seized power in Florence. The adult members of the family fled the city. Catherine was left behind. The new Republican government placed her in a convent and held her as a hostage. For a time, the convent may have been the safest place of her childhood. The nuns treated her kindly, taught her, and tried to shield her from the fear spreading through the city. Then an army appeared outside the walls of Florence. It had been sent by her relative, Pope Clement VII, to restore the Medici to power. The situation was almost absurd in its cruelty. Outside the city, soldiers fought in the name of Catherine's family. Inside, Catherine remained trapped among people whose hatred for that family grew with every month of the siege. Food became scarce, disease spread, and some of the more radical Florentines began discussing what should be done with the 11-year-old girl. One proposal was to lower her naked in a basket over the city wall, directly into the artillery fire of her relative's army. Another was to hand her over to soldiers, destroying her value as a future dynastic bride. Neither plan was carried out. But Catherine could already understand that the adults were not discussing her as a child. They were discussing her name, her body, and the political price that body might one day command. When an armed group came to remove her from the convent, Catherine believed she was being taken to her death. According to a famous account, she cut off her hair, put on a nun's habit, and tried to present herself as a bride of Christ, perhaps hoping that the protection of the church might serve her better than the name Medici ever had. Florence eventually surrendered. Catherine survived and was returned to her family. It might have seemed that the worst was over, but her relatives had not preserved her life so she could decide what to do with it. They had preserved a valuable bride. When Florence fell, Catherine was returned to her relative and guardian, Pope Clement VII. He welcomed her warmly and then did what the Medici had done since the moment she was born: decided who she would be useful to next. The choice fell on Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I of France. Catherine was 14. Henry was almost the same age. In October 1533, they were married in Marseille. For Clement VII, the marriage joined the Medici to one of Europe's oldest monarchies. For Francis I, it promised money, influence in Italy, and papal support. Catherine was essential to the agreement, but she had no part in making it. A year later, Clement VII died. Part of the promised dowry was never paid, and with the Pope's death, much of Catherine's political value disappeared. The French nobility had always looked down on the Medici as bankers who had risen too quickly. Now Catherine became the merchant's daughter, tolerated at court, but never accepted as an equal by the old aristocratic families. Henry did not necessarily treat her with open cruelty. That would almost have been easier. He simply rarely chose her. His attention belonged to Diane de Poitiers, a woman nearly 20 years older than he was. Diane was the one he trusted. Diane received his lands and jewels. Diane stood beside him with the confidence Catherine had never been allowed to develop. Catherine attended ceremonies, smiled when required, and learned to live beside the woman who held a more secure place in Henry's life than his own wife did. As long as Henry remained the king's second son, the couple's childlessness could be treated as a private disappointment. Then, in 1536, Henry's older brother died unexpectedly. Henry became heir to the French throne. Catherine's inability to conceive was no longer a private matter. It had become a crisis of state. 10 years passed without a child. The court openly discussed divorce. In the 16th century, prolonged childlessness could quickly stop being a medical mystery and become evidence of divine anger, or witchcraft. Catherine already had an interest in astrology, herbs, and unusual remedies. Quietly at first, people began to suspect her of sorcery. She tried everything. She drank the urine of a mule, an animal nature itself had made celestial. She applied mixtures of cow dung and powdered stag antlers to her body. She consulted physicians and astrologers, wore amulets, and swallowed whatever remedy promised either a pregnancy or an explanation for why one had not come. There is one detail her contemporaries could not have known. A modern retrospective medical study has suggested that Henry II may have had a congenital anatomical condition, possibly hypospadias complicated by curvature, which could have made conception difficult. This remains a theory offered centuries later, not a proven diagnosis. But it changes the way the story looks. A young woman was nearly destroyed by whispers of witchcraft for something that may never have been her fault. What would you have done in her place? Accepted a divorce and disappeared from French history? Or trusted any physician, any amulet, any promise that said a child might still come? Then, after 10 years of humiliation, something happened that the court had almost stopped expecting. Catherine became pregnant. In January 1544, she gave birth to Francis. Then, Catherine became pregnant again, and again. Over the next 12 years, she gave birth to 10 children, 5 of them sons. After a decade in which the court had threatened to replace her as a barren wife, the House of Valois suddenly had more princes than most dynasties could have hoped for. Catherine's final delivery nearly killed her. In 1556, she gave birth to twin girls. One was stillborn after a desperate medical intervention. The other lived for less than 2 months. Afterward, physicians warned that another pregnancy might kill Catherine. But she had already fulfilled her dynastic duty many times over. It was during these years that she summoned Nostradamus to Paris and asked him to explain his cryptic prophecies and draw up horoscopes for her children. A later legend claimed that he told Catherine she would become the mother of 3 kings of France. The exact words cannot be proved, but 3 of her sons would indeed wear the crown. Neither the mother nor the astrologer had asked the more important question: how many of those kings would leave a son behind? Later, when everything had already happened to the House of Valois, it would seem as though the misfortune of Catherine's Florentine family had simply followed her into France. A beautiful thought, not a fact. For the moment, Catherine could believe she had won. She had a royal husband, several sons, and a dynasty secured for generations. Then Henry II decided to ride onto the tournament field one more time. In the summer of 1559, the French court was celebrating peace with Spain and 2 royal weddings. Henry II entered a jousting tournament. After one unsatisfactory pass, he insisted on riding again. The lance of the Count of Montgomery shattered against the king's helmet. Splinters tore through the visor and drove into Henry's face and eye. The king remained alive for 10 days. Physicians tried to save him, but the wound became infected. Henry died on July 10th. Afterward, the court remembered a quatrain by Nostradamus describing a young lion defeating an older one and piercing his eye inside a golden cage. Before the tournament, no one had treated those lines as a clear description of Henry's death. Afterward, the coincidence looked like prophecy. Catherine put on black mourning clothes and never abandoned them. The woman Henry had kept far from power was now the mother of the new king. But the new king was a sickly 16-year-old boy, Francis II, and France was already beginning to divide along religious lines. Francis II ruled for less than a year and a half. In late 1560, a severe infection in his ear spread further, and the young king died. His marriage to Mary, Queen of Scots, had produced no children. The crown passed to his 10-year-old brother, Charles IX. Catherine became regent and inherited a country already being torn apart by the French wars of religion. Catholic and Protestant leaders controlled their own armies, money, and foreign alliances. Catherine maneuvered between them, granted limited rights of Protestant worship, brought theologians together for negotiations, and signed truces that often collapsed before the ink was dry. For years, she tried to do the thing for which history rarely remembers her: negotiate. But every compromise convinced the extremists on both sides that the crown was weak. In the summer of 1572, Protestant nobles gathered in Paris for the wedding of Catherine's daughter Margaret to the Protestant prince Henry of Navarre. The marriage was meant to reconcile 2 Francis. Instead, someone tried to assassinate Admiral Coligny, one of the most important Huguenot leaders. Coligny survived. His supporters demanded that those responsible be found. At court, fear spread that the Huguenots would take up arms immediately. The Royal Council made the fatal decision to strike first and kill several Protestant leaders gathered in Paris. But the murder of a limited number of men almost immediately became a mass killing. Violence swept through Paris and then spread into the provinces. The massacre went far beyond the original decision and escaped the control of those who had set it in motion. Was Catherine responsible for the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre? Yes, in the sense that she took part in the decision to use preemptive violence and strike first. But to claim that she designed every murder in Paris and across France is to give her a degree of control that no one possessed once the killing began. In trying to protect her son's authority, Catherine moved step by step from negotiation toward decisions whose consequences she could no longer contain. Charles IX had less than 2 years left to live. He died at 23, wasted by tuberculosis. Later stories claimed that after the massacre, he was tormented by nightmares and cried out to his mother, "Who but you is the cause of all this?" That may be one of the legends that quickly grew around the bloodshed. What is certain is that Charles left a legitimate daughter and an illegitimate son, but no legitimate boy who could inherit the French crown. For the 3rd time, one of Catherine's sons became king. And for the 3rd time, there was no heir beside the throne. Henry III was the most capable and probably the most beloved of Catherine's sons. He was educated, politically experienced, and had already been elected King of Poland before returning to France. His marriage to Louise of Lorraine remained childless. Why, we do not know. There is no proof that Henry himself was incapable of fathering children. It was simply another royal marriage in which no child appeared. But while his younger brother Francis remained alive, the Valois still had one possible line of succession. Francis could marry. He could have a son. In 1584, Francis died at 29, leaving no legitimate children. Now there was no brother behind Henry III, no legitimate boy anywhere in the family. The entire future of the dynasty rested on one childless man. To Catherine, the scene must have looked familiar. She had once been left as the only legitimate child of a Medici branch in which there were no men left. Now the final man of another dynasty was her own son. And it was at that moment that Henry stopped listening to her. In December 1588, he secretly ordered the assassination of the powerful Duke of Guise inside the Château de Blois. Catherine was not warned. Henry told her only after the killing had already taken place. For almost 30 years, she had negotiated with her son's enemies and tried to repair the consequences of their decisions. Now, Henry had opened a war with the Catholic League without asking her advice. This time, there was nothing Catherine could repair. Catherine died 7 months before the last Valois king fell. 11 years later, another Medici woman arrived in France, Marie de Medici. But she came from a different branch of the family. The male line of Catherine's senior branch had ended with her father. Marie descended from the cadet branch that had taken power in Florence after the older line failed. Within a year, she gave the Bourbons the heir Catherine's 5 sons had failed to leave the Valois. Florentine blood returned to the French throne. Just not Catherine's blood. 2 of Europe's greatest houses, neither fell in a single blow. Both faded slowly, without an heir to carry the name forward. Catherine caused neither collapse. She simply lived exactly between them. Call it fate, call it coincidence. History only keeps the dates.